Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into the most brutal, bone-crunching, gore-filled experiences the Xbox 360 ever gave us. These games didn't just push the limits of violence, they swung a chainsaw into those limits and laugh. If you love deep dives like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more awesome gaming breakdown. Gears of War Trilogy. The Gears of War Trilogy is basically the Xbox 360's unofficial mascot for violent gaming done right. These games didn't just offer shooting, they offered deliciously over-the-top chaos where your lance or chainsaw wasn't just a weapon, but a lifestyle. Gears 1 set the tone in 2006 with its gritty, muddy world and weighty combat. Every gun felt like it could rip through concrete, and every locust encounter looked like someone spilled a bucket of red paint on the wall. Except it wasn't paint, and you definitely caused it. The game also introduced active reloads, which punished you for being slow, but rewarded you with extra power if you nailed the timing, making firefights even more tense. Gears 2 came in with a bigger plot, bigger explosions, and even bigger creatures. The violence scaled up dramatically, especially with the addition of new finishing moves that turned enemies into meat sculptures. The story also got more emotional, which was impressive considering you were playing as characters built like refrigerators. Some players joked that Marcus and Dom didn't run, they thundered. By the time Gears 3 landed in 2011, the franchise looked cleaner and more polished. Critics complained that the game tried to pack too many story threads together, but even with those flaws, the violence and gameplay remained top tier. The trilogy showed how brutality could be part of a world's identity instead of an empty gimmick. And honestly, it's still one of the most fun action series ever made. Ninja Gaiden 2. Ninja Gaiden 2 is the kind of game that says, what if we take a normal action game and then multiply the blood by 200? Ryu Hayabusa slices through enemies so fast that arms, legs, and heads fly off like someone spilled a box of body part confetti. This 2008 sequel embraced ultra-violence as part of its personality, and it never once apologized for it. You'd run through levels, leaving behind trails that made janitors everywhere cry. The game's combat is brutally fast, with combos that require actual practice. This wasn't a game where you mash buttons and win. It was more like taking a martial arts exam while everything is exploding around you. Players loved the intensity, but complained about the camera, which sometimes acted like it wanted you to fail. It would swing behind walls, zoom in too close, or just stare into space like it got bored. Some enemies also attacked nonstop, giving beginners the impression that the game wanted to bully them. And honestly, it probably did. But once you adjusted, the combat felt incredibly rewarding. The dismemberment system wasn't only for style. Injured enemies became more aggressive, forcing you to finish them quickly. Ninja Gaiden 2 became a cult classic because it mixed intense challenge with unapologetic gore, and it still stands as one of the most violent hack-and-slash titles the Xbox 360 ever received. Dead Rising. Dead Rising was like a comedy show mixed with a horror film inside a shopping mall. You played as Frank West, a journalist who covered wars, but was definitely not prepared for the mess he walked into. The game dropped tens of thousands of zombies into a mall and told you to go wild with anything you could pick up. Golf clubs? Sure. Chainsaws? Even better. An entire bench? Go for it. A toy lightsaber? Why not? It was the ultimate playground of chaos. The violence came from creativity. You didn't just kill zombies, you styled on them. You could mow down crowds with a lawnmower or shove shower heads into their skulls and watch water spray out like a broken faucet. There was a timer system that forced you to pick missions thoughtfully, but some players hated that because it felt stressful and limited experimentation. The save system also caused arguments, since one slot meant you couldn't undo mistakes. Even with complaints, Dead Rising was a milestone for sandbox brutality. It redefined how violent games could be fun rather than just grim. Rise of Nightmare. Rise of Nightmares is famous for two things: being Kinect-controlled and being extremely bloody. If you've ever wanted to karate chop monsters in real life and accidentally knock over your lamp, this game made that dream possible. Released in 2011, it put players in the shoes of a tourist trapped in a nightmare full of grotesque creatures, deranged villains, and enough gore to fill a swimming pool. The violence wasn't subtle. You used your actual arms to swing axes, knives, and other sharp objects, letting you slice enemies in ways that felt surprisingly physical. Kinect accuracy wasn't perfect, though. Sometimes your character swung wildly because the sensor misread your movement, making you look like you were trying to swat a fly instead of fighting undead horrors. Critics joked that the scariest part of the game was the motion control, but for many players, that chaotic energy made the experience fun. The storyline mixed B-movie charm with gruesome visuals, and the whole game felt like a weird, haunted house attraction. If you committed to the silliness, the violence became part of the entertainment rather than a serious horror experience. Onechanbara, Bikini Samurai Squad. Onechanbara, Bikini Samurai Squad is exactly what it sounds like. A game about sword-swinging women in bikinis fighting zombies. It mixes campy humor with copious amounts of blood, and the result is a strange blend of silliness and violence. Released in Japan in 2006 and in the West in 2009, the game gained attention not because it was a masterpiece, but because it was so unapologetically weird. Combat revolves around slicing through hordes of zombies with flashy moves. You could chop enemies in half, send blood spraying across the screen, and even watch your character get drenched in red like she walked through a paint studio explosion. The violence was cartoony, but the game still pushed boundaries in how much splatter it showed. Critics pointed out that the controls felt stiff and repetitive, and the camera sometimes hid enemies at the worst times. But fans appreciated the game for leaning into its absurdity. It never pretended to be deep or realistic. It simply offered chaotic, over-the-top action wrapped in a grindhouse aesthetic. The Dishwasher duology. The Dishwasher games were the kind of 2D action titles that made players say, "Wow, I didn't know side-scrollers could be this violent." Both Dead Samurai, 2009, and Vampire Smile, 2011, were created by a single developer, and you could tell he poured every chaotic idea into them. These games used fast/heavy combat mixed with black and white art splattered in glowing red to make every attack feel brutal. You weren't just beating enemies, you were turning them into inkblot explosions of limbs and fluids. The violence felt rhythmic. You could juggle enemies, slice them apart, and then do finishing moves that looked almost poetic in a ridiculous, over-the-top way. The games were small in scale compared to big AAAS, but the creativity made them stand out. Some players thought the difficulty was too high, especially during boss fights that demanded perfect timing. Others said the story was confusing and felt like it jumped between edgy and surreal without clear transitions. The platforming sections also got criticism for occasionally slowing the pace, but the tight combat completely redeemed the rough edges. Both titles became cult hits because they took simple mechanics and turned them into stylish, ultra-violent experiences. If you wanted pure action without filler, these games delivered non-stop carnage. Bloodforge. Bloodforge is one of those games where subtlety stays home and the violence takes center stage. Released in 2012, it starred a warrior named Crom, who basically wakes up one day and decides to fight everyone and everything. The world is drenched in Celtic mythology, but the game's visual identity focused mostly on sharp edges, dark shadows, and enough blood to fill a small lake. You could slice enemies in half, decapitate them, tear them apart with brutal finishers, and unleash rage attacks that covered the environment in red. The art style used high contrast and thick outlines, making every motion look dramatic. Some players joked that the entire game looked like a heavy metal album cover brought to life. The violence was gloriously over the top, but critics also pointed out that combat leaned heavily on button mashing instead of depth, which made longer sessions feel repetitive. There were also complaints about camera issues and enemy variety, But despite these flaws, the presentation had charm. It wasn't perfect, but it was definitely memorable. Condemned series, the Condemned games didn't just flirt with violence. They studied it, analyzed it, and then threw you into it face first. Criminal Origins, 2005, and Condemned 2, 2008, created an atmosphere so gritty that players felt like they needed a shower afterward. These games were famous for their brutal first-person melee combat, where pipes, boards, fire axes, and anything you could grab became deadly tools. The violence was grounded and realistic. Instead of flashy combos, you had desperate, messy fights where every hit looked painful. Enemies screamed, lunged, and attacked with unpredictable aggression, often startling players. The sound design also helped. Metal clanks, bone cracks, and heavy breathing made the tension feel real. Some players found the atmosphere almost too intense, especially during dark sequences where enemies hid in shadows. Critics praised the immersion, but criticized the storytelling in the second game. Condemned 2 leaned into bizarre plot twists involving conspiracies and mysterious organizations, which confused fans who preferred the grounded tone of the first game. The shift toward more traditional gunplay also divided players. Still, the Condemned series influenced later horror titles by showing how intimate and frightening melee encounters could be.
We must be getting out of range there, Snake. Isaac, can you hear me? Look, I'm gonna call you back as soon as I can, okay?
Isaac! You were drifting away for a moment there, Mr. Clark.
Dead Space Duology, Dead Space, and Dead Space 2 are legendary for redefining sci-fi horror. These games didn't rely on cheap scares. They relied on terrifying creatures and dismemberment mechanics that encouraged you to think tactically. Instead of shooting enemies in the head, you cut off their limbs to stop them. The violence wasn't just decoration, it was core gameplay. Necromorphs twisted and reshaped human bodies into grotesque nightmares. Every encounter felt like you were facing something that shouldn't exist. Dead Space 2008 leaned heavily into slow, atmospheric horror where every hallway felt dangerous. Dead Space 2 2011 ramped things up with more action and more dramatic set pieces. Both games had some of the most disturbing enemy designs ever seen on the 360, and the gore supported the idea that these creatures used to be human. Critics noted that the zero-gravity sections sometimes felt clunky and disorienting. Some players also thought the second game leaned too far into action at the cost of pure horror. But even with those complaints, both titles were praised for their sound design, intense combat, and unforgettable visuals. Left 4 Dead 2. Left 4 Dead 2 is what happens when you take a zombie apocalypse and give it the energy of a rock concert. Fast-paced, chaotic, and filled with more undead than a Halloween parade, this 2009 title became a beloved co-op shooter. The violence came from mowing down hordes with shotguns, axes, chainsaws, and even frying pans. Every weapon created its own messy result, and the physics made encounters unpredictable and hilarious. The special infected added even more chaos. You had chargers smashing through groups, spitters melting floors with acid, and tanks throwing chunks of concrete like baseball. The game didn't waste time with long cutscenes or dramatic speeches. It threw you into action and said, "Good luck surviving." Some players criticized the difficulty spikes, especially in expert mode where a single mistake could ruin an entire run. Bots were also inconsistent and sometimes acted like they needed glasses. Still, the game became iconic because of its teamwork-heavy design. The violence felt exciting instead of grim, and the replayability kept players coming back for years. Bulletstorm. Bulletstorm is the definition of chaotic fun. Instead of basic shooting, it introduced the skill shot system, rewarding players for killing enemies in the most creative and ridiculous ways possible. Kick an enemy into a cactus? Points. Throw someone into an explosive barrel? More points. Use a whip to launch a guy into the air and blast him mid-flight? Even more points. Violence became a game within the game. The tone was intentionally silly, filled with over-the-top trash talk and loud personality. Some critics thought the humor tried too hard, especially with the constant jokes. Others felt the story leaned heavily on cliché, but the gameplay made up for it. Every level gave new opportunities to experiment, and the weapons felt powerful without being mindless. The world also looked vibrant, which contrasted nicely with the ridiculous destruction you caused. Bulletstorm encouraged players to be playful with violence. Even if some jokes didn't land, the creativity made this one of the most entertaining shooters of the 360 era. Splatterhouse. Splatterhouse is one of those games that walks into the room covered in blood and doesn't bother to explain itself. The 2010 reboot brought back the classic horror beat-em-up formula with modern visuals that looked like someone gave a comic book a gallon of red paint and told it to go wild. You play as Rick, a guy who transforms into a hulking monster thanks to a spooky mask that talks way too much but somehow becomes your best friend. Together, you carve through nightmarish enemies with punches, blades, and bone-ripping finishers that would make even horror movie fans wince. The violence is extreme. You can tear enemies in half, rip out organs, use limbs as weapons, and basically perform anatomy demonstrations that would get you kicked out of medical school. Some players felt the combat became repetitive after a while, and critics pointed out frame rate dips during busy encounters. The platforming sections also drew complaints for feeling clunky and interrupting the flow of action. But despite the flaws, Splatterhouse delivered a fun, unapologetically gory adventure. It didn't try to be deep, it just wanted you to smash monsters in the messiest way possible. Prototype. Prototype is the power fantasy every kid secretly imagines on the way home from school. You play as Alex Mercer, a guy who wakes up with no memory but discovers he can turn his arms into giant blades, tentacles, hammers, and basically any sharp object your imagination can come up with. The violence is stylish and dramatic, and the open world setting turns New York City into your personal demolition sandbox. Crowds scatter as you sprint up skyscrapers, toss cars around, and slice through soldiers like vegetables. The gore level is high, especially when you use moves that let you explode enemies or consume them to gain abilities. Some players complained that the story felt confusing with its conspiracies and flashbacks jumping around. Critics also mentioned that the open world sometimes felt empty between missions. Even with those issues, Prototype made combat satisfying. The movement alone felt amazing. You could leap across entire blocks, glide through the air, and attack enemies in mid-flight. It blended parkour, superpowers, and gritty action into something that still stands out years later. Mortal Kombat 2011 brought the franchise roaring back with some of the most ridiculous, bone-crunching fatalities ever animated. This reboot retold the classic story, but mixed it with modern mechanics and graphics that made every punch and slice feel impactful. The fatalities became the biggest highlight, turning the game into a gruesome showcase of creativity. You could tear out spines, slice enemies in half, and crush skulls with slow-motion X-ray moves that showed bones snapping inside bodies like glow sticks. Some players found the story mode surprisingly good for a fighting game, though others felt the cutscenes dragged on too long. A few characters were considered unbalanced in competitive play, which caused online arguments that lasted months. But the overall combat system won praise for being accessible to newcomers while still offering depth for pros. The violence wasn't just shock value, it became a core part of the game's humor and style. Mortal Kombat embraced its identity fully, delivering fights that were fast, fun, and incredibly messy. Dead Island combined vacation vibes with pure disaster. You begin on a tropical resort that looks perfect for a holiday, except zombies have moved in and ruined everything. The violence is up close and raw, with melee weapons like pipes, machetes, axes, and paddles becoming tools of survival. Every hit lands with weight, sending limbs flying or bodies collapsing in messy ragdoll heap. The game had RPG progression, letting you upgrade skills and modify weapons. Players loved creating electrified machetes or burning baseball bat, but the combat was the real draw. The dismemberment system made every encounter feel personal. Critics mentioned that the story was weak, and some quests felt repetitive, especially the fetch missions scattered throughout the map. There were also bugs at launch that became memes in the community, even with the rough edges. Dead Island delivered a fun, violent, open-world experience. Marvelous verdict. Thanks for sticking with us through this wild journey into the bloodiest, craziest Xbox 360 titles ever made. These games pushed boundaries and gave players unforgettable moments filled with action and over-the-top brutality. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss our deep dives into gaming's wildest worlds. See you in the next one.